Take a moment and imagine this. Could listening to a simple song be one of the most dangerous acts of your life? A melody, a guitar riff, a rhythm. Not just a hobby, but a whisper of rebellion, a scream for freedom. And the price? Your freedom, your future, maybe even your life. This isn't a science fiction story. This was the harsh reality for tens of millions of people living behind the Iron Curtain in the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union. In those years, music on Soviet soil became a weapon, but not the state's weapon. It belonged to the youth, the dreamers, the dissidents. Every note was a stone thrown at the wall of censorship. Every secret concert, an act of collective courage. And this music found its way through the unlikeliest of places, in the strangest of forms, sometimes in the crackling sound of a copied cassette, sometimes in a dim apartment corner, and sometimes even etched onto discarded X-ray films from hospitals. Today, I'll tell you that story. The story of how the Soviet regime battled with art and how forbidden melodies turned into a symphony of resistance. This is not just about music. It's about the human spirit's longing for freedom.
To truly understand the phenomenon of forbidden music, we first need to grasp the suffocating control the Soviet ideology placed on every aspect of life, especially art. In the Soviet Union, art was not a form of personal expression. It was not for beauty. It was a weapon, a tool, a machine of propaganda for the party. Its sole purpose was to serve the state, to shape the minds of its citizens, and to glorify communism and the triumph of the Soviet man. Creativity was not seen as an expression of a free spirit. It was raw material to be molded by ideology. Every line, every word, every note had to stay within the party's boundaries. Every painting, every poem, every symphony, every song had to align perfectly with the party's message. Creativity was not about innovation. It was about obedience. Anything that deviated from the official aesthetic, socialist realism, was considered dangerous. This doctrine demanded that art depict the glory of the revolution, the victories of the working class, and the supremacy of communist ideology, all in a realistic yet idealized way. A painter's masterpiece, no matter how technically brilliant, was seen as useless, even harmful, if it didn't portray the idealized image of a farm worker or the heroic rhythm of a steel mill. Artists were expected to surrender not just their brushes or instruments, but their very souls to the system. Otherwise, they would fall from favor, face censorship, or worse, repression. This control wasn't just about what was being created, but also what was seen, heard, and read. State-controlled radio stations only played state-approved music. Record labels only released government-sanctioned artists. There were no underground clubs, no independent spaces for free artistic expression. The cultural landscape was like a manicured garden. Only a few state-approved flowers were allowed to bloom. Everything else was treated like a weed, pulled out by the root, often along with the gardener. The Ministry of Culture worked hand in hand with the KGB to detect and destroy any trace of ideological deviation before it could take root. Art was under absolute state control. Every form of expression was seen as a potential threat. But why this intense fear of Western music and art? Because to the Soviet regime, genres like rock, jazz, blues, and later punk represented everything they stood against: individualism, rebellion, emotional freedom, and a direct challenge to their enforced collective lifestyle. It wasn't just about musical taste, it was about ideological purity.
Jazz was dismissed as music of the fat, rock and roll as ideological poison, and punk the scream of the anarchist. Even within classical music, avant-garde composers or anything resembling a Western sound was seen as suspicious. Even great composers like Dmitri Shostakovich, despite their genius, were forced to walk a tightrope between artistic integrity and regime expectations. They faced repeated official condemnations and were forced to make public self-criticisms, while their works hovered constantly on the edge of being banned. Their music was not just for themselves, it became a refuge for the spirit of an entire people.
These genres weren't merely entertainment, they were perceived as tools of espionage and psychological warfare. The regime believed that the West used such music to infiltrate the minds of Soviet youth, corrupting them, breeding dissent, and ultimately threatening the foundation of the communist system. Owning a banned record, attending a secret concert, or even humming a forbidden tune could attract the attention of the KGB, leading to interrogations, expulsions from university, job loss, the end of a career, or worse. If an artist created a piece deemed unacceptable by the state, their work would be pulled from publication, their exhibitions canceled, and they could be accused of treason against the homeland. Such was the cost of art. To pursue music or artistic expression became a political act, a silent protest against the regime that sought to control not just your actions, but your thoughts and emotions. And yet, despite this overwhelming control and the ever-present threat of the KGB, the human spirit resisted, especially the youth. The desire to express oneself, to find something new, something real, something that spoke to an inner longing, cannot be fully extinguished. Every band sparked another creative workaround. And so, forbidden music and art found their way, like an underground river, carving secret channel through the cracks, through whispers in tiny apartments, through hand-copied manuscripts, through melodies scratched into old bones. These were the first signs of how, even under oppression, art in the Soviet Union found ways to survive.
Even in the darkest days of censorship and repression in the Soviet Union, the human spirit found ways to breathe, to seek truth, and to express itself freely. One of the purest forms of this search was a silent war, fought with the written word, samizdat. Meaning self-published, samizdat was a raw but powerful way of bypassing state censorship, a way to spread forbidden ideas, literature, even news. Just like melodies whispered in an apartment concert, samizdat became a drip of truth that reached where the printing press never could. Each copy was an act of resistance. In the Soviet Union, books, magazines, newspapers, all printed words were fully controlled by the state. Every single sentence had to pass through the party's filters. Even the classics of world literature could be banned or censored if they didn't fit the Soviet lens. Works like George Orwell's 1984 or Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago were completely absent from official publications. But censorship only fueled curiosity. People began to seek out information through alternative, hidden means. Samizdat was the natural result of that hunger, a survival mechanism, a form of resistance, and an island of intellectual freedom. It wasn't just a hobby, it became a way of life. For underground intellectuals, accessing forbidden knowledge became a badge of honor. Samizdat's process was simple but dangerous. Someone would obtain a copy of a banned text, maybe from a friend, a stranger, or smuggled in from abroad. They would retype it, often by hand or on a typewriter. But even typewriters could be traced.
Each one left a unique imprint, and authorities could match a document to its machine. So copying was done in secret, often at night, under blankets, with ears tuned to every creak in the silence. Each keystroke felt like whispering a melody of defiance into the estate's ear. As a page turned, the soft click of the keys echoed like the rhythm of freedom.
3 or 5 more would be made from it to avoid drawing suspicion. Each finished copy would be handed off to someone trusted, who was expected to copy it again and pass it on. This was the read, copy, pass on cycle. Samizdat wasn't just an information network, it was a web of trust, an unspoken social contract. It was the KGB's worst nightmare, a hidden flow of information they couldn't control. These texts carried Western ideas, but also unveiled the Soviet reality, the gulags, the repression, the silence. Each copied page was a small rebellion, a torch of freedom, a literary grenade. But the Samizdat spirit wasn't limited to the written word. It spilled into music, creating a parallel phenomenon known as magnetistat. From the word magnet, magnetistat referred to the secret duplication and hand-to-hand sharing of forbidden music tapes. Recordings from radio broadcasts, especially from Western stations like Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, bootleg vinyl, or smuggled tapes would spread across the far corners of Russia. Just like the X-ray records, these tapes often suffered from poor quality, but that only made them more special. The crackles and muffled tones whispered that this was forbidden music, music acquired with effort and danger. Each tape traveled like a spy, from house to house, city to city. They usually had handwritten track lists, messy scrawls, a pure expression of DIY rebellion.
But the true magic of this music came alive in live performances. Official venues were closed to degenerate music, so young musicians and passionate listeners found another way. Kwartikniki, literally apartment concerts. These weren't grand stages, they were cramped, run-down flats. A few friends, a borrowed guitar, maybe a broken bass, a wheezing amp, buckets and panelids instead of drums. And despite the risks, the room would fill. People sat shoulder to shoulder on the floor, packed tight, breathless. This was where the magic happened, where bands' melodies came alive, where souls trembled for the first time. Each note shook the walls. Each heartbeat raced. These concerts were air holes, escape tunnels into freedom. The atmosphere at these Kwartikniki concerts was charged with both tension and excitement. Entry was secret, spread through trusted circles, whispered from ear to ear. Young people used code names, changed meeting points frequently. Windows were covered with thick blankets or coats to muffle the sound and avoid unwanted attention. There was always someone keeping watch by the door. If there was a knock or a strange noise in the stairwell, a prearranged signal would be given, like a cough or someone saying, "The tea is ready." Instantly, the room fell silent. Everyone pretended to be chatting, reading a book, or doing something harmless. Hearts raced. The fear of being caught made the music feel even more powerful. Because this wasn't just a concert, it was the collective act of courage and unity. Every clap was a whisper of defiance. Every song, a vow of freedom. From these hidden gatherings emerged many of the bands and musicians who would later become legends in Soviet rock history. They would never appear on official stages, but they won a place in the hearts of millions. In those early years, their music spread mainly through magnetosizdat and Kwartikniki shows, not yet mass movements, but secret springs that nourished the spirit. Their songs became the voice of youth, an anthem of resistance. And among all the symbols of this underground movement, one would stand out the most: bone music. In the cramped rooms of Soviet apartments, The acoustic hum of guitars was only a drop in the ocean of sound the youth truly longed for. What they really craved were those massive electrified waves of Western music. The screaming guitar solos, the thunderous drums, the familiar but forbidden voices. It all seemed like a distant dream. But in a world where vinyl records were rare luxuries, where every foreign sound was monitored or banned, how did they even hear it? That's where desperation, ingenuity, and rebellion met in a strange, beautiful invention: bone music. Music pressed onto discarded X-ray films. It wasn't just a workaround. It was a quiet triumph over a totalitarian regime, a proof of how deep the hunger for music, for freedom, could run. Imagine holding a transparent X-ray once used to scan someone's lungs or heart. You can see the faint shadows of ribs, vertebrae, traces of a human body. That film may have come from a hospital waste bin, or perhaps was smuggled out by a sympathetic nurse, bribed doctor, or a fearless scavenger. Each film would soon carry something new, not a physical anatomy, but a spiritual melody. They were no longer just medical waste. They became the lifeblood of an underground world, each one a slice of hope, a visa to freedom. These X-rays were carefully cut into circles and placed on modified record players. The material was thin and fragile, nowhere near as durable as vinyl, and the sound quality was poor, but no one cared. What mattered was hearing it, feeling the forbidden rhythm. The crackles, the distortion, the gritty textures, they became part of the music itself. Each scratch whispered the danger, the secrecy, the defiance. Every hiss and pop sounded like the walls of the system beginning to crumble. The process of making these records was delicate and bold. Sometimes they were copied from smuggled vinyls, other times from strong radio signals like Voice of America. The sound would be transferred onto the X-ray using a homemade stylus or sharp engraving needle. The people behind this were known as Rongen Izdat, underground distributors and craftsmen. Working in dimly lit rooms, they were modern-day alchemists, forging records with precision and nerve. Each disc they created was not just a copy, it was a handmade piece of resistance, a fragile masterpiece of rebellion and love for music. These bone records were rarely made in large numbers. X-rays wore out quickly, and the process was time-consuming. Besides, mass production would attract attention. Each new copy was usually a bit worse in quality, but none of that mattered. People waited for weeks just to get one. They'd pay small fortunes for a record that might only last a few hours. But that short-lived sound was worth everything. It wasn't just a record. It was a breath of freedom, a crack in the Iron Curtain. Bone music existed thanks to a secret network of brave souls, the music smugglers, the underground couriers, often young, idealistic, deeply passionate, and willing to risk everything. The risks were enormous: KGB surveillance, arrest, imprisonment, forced labor camps, exile, all for a rock record. But they believed it was worth it. They knew how vital this music was for the spirit, how it lifted people's hopes and helped them feel alive. They weren't just selling records. They were spreading courage, planting seeds of resistance, whispering hope through shadows. These underground heroes collected X-rays from hospital trash, bribed workers, or snuck into dumpsters. In their makeshift home studios, they transferred music from rare Western records or radio broadcasts onto bone. The work was slow, risky, and exhausting. Each record was a labor of love, a protest carved into plastic. And with each new disc, the danger grew. The chain of distribution stretched over hundreds of kilometers, reaching thousands of young ears.
When a smuggler got caught, the entire network was at risk. There would be interrogations, beatings, pressure to give names. The KGB was ruthless. But for everyone who fell, another would rise. Because this wasn't just about music, it was about standing up to silence. To them, listening to rock and roll wasn't just fun. It was an act of resistance, a declaration of self. These were the unsung heroes of the Soviet underground. Without their courage, these sounds may never have reached the surface. They were living proof of how vital the free flow of music and information can be. These discs didn't just carry music, they carried stories. The ghostly silhouettes of bones etched into them were symbols of how deeply forbidden sound had seeped into Soviet bodies and souls. Each crackle, each skip, was a whisper of hunger, defiance, and longing. Bone music wasn't just a hack, it was a cultural phenomenon, a raw and haunting reminder of how far people will go to feel free. A bone, a needle, a melody. Sometimes that's all you need to challenge an empire.
By the late 1980s, something was simmering beneath the surface of the Soviet Union. This wasn't just about a secret melody or a whispered poem anymore. This was a pressure buildup, rumbling underground, on the verge of explosion. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika had started to crack the Iron Curtain. It wasn't full freedom, but for the first time, artists and youth had a breath of air, and they chose to scream with it. That scream was called punk. Punk wasn't just music. It was a philosophy, a lifestyle, a manifesto of this belief. Soviet punk carried an even rawer, more pure fury than its Western counterpart. While Western punks screamed at consumerism and bourgeois norms, Soviet punks screamed directly at the state, at its lies, its monotony, its censorship. For them, every song was a punch, every guitar chord a scream, every performance a revolt. Life is meaningless, there's no future, the system is rotten. Not whispered, but shouted, amplified, hurled from the stage. Spiky hair, ripped clothes, fire in their eyes. They weren't just playing music, they were demanding to exist. Glasnost had opened a small window for artistic expression. Some underground clubs and youth centers were given limited permission to host live music, under KGB watch, of course. But the whispers had become roars. It wasn't just bone music in hidden corners anymore. This was louder, more collective, and far more dangerous. Police raids were still a risk, but courage had grown. The moment performers hit the stage, adrenaline took over. It erased fear. It ignited something. These concerts weren't just shows. They were explosions of emotion. Musicians poured years of frustration into every note. The crowd didn't just listen. They screamed back. They felt free. And more importantly, they felt not alone. The shows became therapy sessions, acts of collective catharsis. Everyone shared the same pain, the same desire to breathe something real. Music became the invisible thread binding them together, a line in the sand between them and the system. It was more than melody. It was a call to stand together, to rise as one.
Despite perestroika, Western music still wasn't freely available. Vinyls were scarce and expensive, so once again, cassette tapes became the lifeblood of the underground. Brought in by diplomats, sailors, smugglers, punk, new wave, post-punk, all leaked into the Soviet consciousness on magnetic tape. These tapes were treasures. They'd be copied 100 times. The sound degrading, but never losing value. Each hiss, each warble reminded you this music was forbidden, and that made it more precious. These weren't just songs, they were windows into a new world, a worldview packed into hissy audio. They showed Soviet youth how others lived, how they dressed, what they rebelled against. Lyrics, style, attitude, it was all revolutionary. The DIY philosophy was nothing new. They'd learned from Samizdat how to create their own culture. They made their own ripped jeans, safety pin jackets, and political patches. They made fanzines, gritty, handmade magazines that combined music reviews with political satire, poetry, and raw emotion. The zines were chaotic, blurred images, cut and paste collages, messy layouts. But that was the point. They didn't need to be pretty. They just needed to be true. They formed a parallel media universe, fully independent, fiercely rebellious. Every zine was a manifesto of resistance. Icons of Soviet punk and underground rock. Viktor Tsoi and Kino. Tsoi, often called the heart of Soviet rock and mirror of a generation, became the voice of youth. His songs moved from personal melancholy to sharp social critique. Dressed like a regular worker, he sang with poetic depth. His anthem, Berimen, or Change, became a generational cry, even as it clashed with official politics. Simple yet profound lyrics, a melancholic voice, and magnetic stage presence, he moved millions. Tsoi stadium shows in Moscow and Leningrad became legends. After his tragic death in 1990, he became a symbol of resistance that lived on, even after the USSR collapsed. Aquarium and Boris Grebenshchikov, among the first to bring psychedelic and folk rock into the Soviet scene. Grebenshchikov's lyrics were poetic, philosophical, spiritual. Despite poor recording quality, Aquarium's cassette tapes spread far and wide, becoming mythic. He wasn't a loud rebel. He was a quiet mystic, offering an inner path to freedom. Zvuki Mu and Pyotr Mamonov. Absurd, experimental, unpredictable. Mamonov's performances were part punk, part theater, part madness. He mocked the senselessness of the Soviet machine through surreal shows, where the audience became part of the performance. Later, his work with David Byrne signaled a crossover between Soviet underground and Western avant-garde. Zvuki Mu stood for one idea: laugh at the system. That itself was revolutionary. Machina Vremeni, or Time Machine, one of the oldest and most beloved Soviet rock bands, formed in 1969. Though more accessible, they too suffered bans and censorship. Their lyrics, filled with allegories like puppets, challenged the system without naming it. They walked the tightrope between popularity and rebellion, a true voice for the masses.
These bands, and many others, became beacons in a gray world. They weren't just making music. They were shouting the pain, the frustration, the desperate hunger for freedom. Underground clubs became sanctuaries, classrooms, and battlegrounds. Here, forbidden ideas flowed freely, new movements were born, and youth found something that truly spoke to them. Samizdat had carried words. Magnetizdat had carried sound. Now, the stage itself had become the battleground for truth. This was more than secret music. This was the start of a cultural revolution. Microphones, guitar amps, fanzines, these were the cracks in the wall. And the noise pouring through them, that was the sound of the Iron Curtain coming down.
By the late 1980s, the small windows opened by Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika were quickly widening into deep cracks. This wasn't just space to breathe anymore. It was the start of a storm. The pressure that had built up underground was becoming an avalanche. Years of censorship, economic stagnation, and growing disillusionment could no longer be contained. And the music, once whispered in underground apartments, crackling on X-ray records, had become a shouted anthem in public squares. The wind of freedom was slipping through the cracks of the Iron Curtain, ready to change everything. By 1991, the world held its breath as one of the greatest empires in history quietly unraveled. The Soviet Union collapsed, faster and with more silence than anyone expected. It wasn't just political, it shook the lives, identities, and dreams of millions of people. The curtain of secrecy fell. Radio stations, TV channels, record labels, all began broadcasting once banned Western music and the voices of Soviet underground bands. Choi's song Beremen, Change, once forbidden, now echoed freely in the streets. His call had become reality.
No more secret concerts in basements, no more X-ray discs or smuggled tapes passed hand to hand. Rock, jazz, and punk had surfaced, part of the mainstream now. It was like a long winter had finally thawed. Soviet youth could now access music and knowledge they once only dreamed of. Record stores opened, radios played Western hits, concert halls overflowed with people. For an entire generation, it was a release, a celebration, a long-awaiting moment of freedom. Music was no longer a weapon of resistance. It had become a symphony of liberty, a gift that could be enjoyed anytime, anywhere. Those who once risked everything to play or hear forbidden music, what happened to them? Some flourished in this new age of freedom. They finally reached bigger audiences, recorded real albums, and realized their dreams. Legends like Victor Tsoi remain powerful symbols of change even after death. His songs became the new Russia's anthems of reflection and hope. Former underground musicians entered professional studios for the first time. Their voices were no longer buried under static. They were clear, bold, and present. But for others, something was lost. The mystique, the danger, the unifying secrecy of underground culture began to fade. Without the risk, without the thrill of rebellion, had music lost some of its power? To many, the value of music had come from the struggle to obtain it. Now that it was everywhere, easily accessible, some felt a strange emptiness, like a diamond turned into a common stone. The fragile X-ray records, once carriers of life-saving melodies, became priceless artifacts. They were now displayed in galleries, kept in museums, sold at auctions. Not just audio recordings, but historical evidence. They were tangible proof of art's resistance to censorship. Each crackle still whispered a story of courage, rebellion, and music that refused to die. These relics stood as silent witnesses to an era when a melody could defy an empire. A reminder that art doesn't submit, that even in the darkest times, music finds a way. The fall of the Soviet Empire felt like the ultimate victory for underground art and music, but it also ushered in new uncertainties. Still, this story remained a powerful lesson in the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the darkest nights of censorship, music found a way forward, scratching itself into bone, whispering through wires, echoing in basements. This wasn't just sound. It was a breath of freedom, a cry of defiance, a generation's hope. It was a testament to the true power of art. A melody, a single note, it cannot break a wall by itself. But when it touches millions of hearts at once, it's no longer just a sound. It becomes a memory, a resistance, an identity. This story is not just about the Soviet Union. It is a reflection of the human spirit. Every banned song, every silenced voice, every suppressed emotion somehow found its way and echoed, sometimes on a piece of bone, sometimes on a cracked cassette tape, but always in someone's heart. Today, we don't need X-ray records. With a single click, we can access millions of songs online. But back then, music wasn't just entertainment, it was essential. Because music wasn't just rhythm, it was a breath of freedom. Maybe we don't record melodies on old films anymore, but those sounds still linger in our ears, and the traces of those brave souls remain in this land. This is not an ending, because music never truly goes silent. It simply takes another form, in another place, inside another heart. A melody doesn't die when it stops playing. It dies when it's forgotten. And this story was told so it would never be forgotten.